Let him speak, I said, even though the sealed glass on the table had already told us enough. I was still wearing my ivory wedding gown, and the pearl buttons at my wrists caught the cold light of the small office behind the reception hall. Outside the locked door, nearly 80 guests were finishing dessert beneath strings of golden lights. The band had lowered its music. Chairs scraped across the oak floor. Somewhere in the ballroom, my younger brother Daniel was waiting for someone to hand him a microphone. In front of me sat a clear, tamper-evident container, holding the drink he believed I had consumed. Beside it lay Laura Mitchell's leather briefcase, my daughter Natalie's printed copy of an email, and a tablet paused on a video frame that showed Daniel standing beside my table. Laura, my attorney for 12 years, rested one hand on the back of the empty chair across from me. Her expression was calm, but I knew her well enough to see the question behind it. "I can stop the speech before it begins," she said. "We already have the recording from the bar area. We have the email. We have the documents from the developer. You do not need to let him continue." I looked toward the narrow window in the door. Through it, I could see a small slice of the reception hall. Daniel stood near the head table in a charcoal suit, smiling as he spoke with our cousin Michael. He looked relaxed, proud even. Every few seconds, his eyes moved toward my empty chair beside Robert. He was waiting for me to return. Or perhaps he was waiting for something else. Confusion. A mistake. A moment he could describe later as proof that I was no longer capable of managing the family trust. "No," I told Laura. "I want everyone to hear what he came here to accomplish." She studied my face for a moment, then nodded. I had not raised my voice. I had not cried. At 68, I had learned that fear did not always make a person tremble. Sometimes it made the smallest details painfully clear. I noticed the faint coffee stain near the edge of Laura's legal pad. I noticed one white rose petal caught in the folds of my skirt. I noticed the second hand on the office clock moving with patient certainty. 20 minutes earlier, Daniel had approached my table while the photographer gathered guests near the windows. He thought I was looking toward the dance floor. I was watching him in the antique mirror behind the service bar. I saw his hand move above my glass. The motion lasted only a second. Megan Foster, the vineyard manager, saw it too. She removed the glass without drawing attention, sealed it, recorded the time, and replaced it with a fresh drink that had never left her sight. Daniel watched me lift the replacement glass to my lips. Then he smiled. That smile was why I wanted him to speak. For months, he had hidden ambition beneath concern. He told relatives that I forgot appointments. He suggested Robert had rushed me into marriage. He asked whether someone my age should control 120 acres of family land. He never said he wanted the trust. He only created reasons why I should not have it. 3 weeks earlier, Natalie had received an email Daniel intended for an attorney with a similar address. In it, he called my wedding an opportunity. He asked whether a public incident could support a request to remove me as trustee. Attached to the message was correspondence with a real estate developer who wanted 30 acres along the lake. Daniel had promised the company that the land could become available once he gained authority. I read that email twice at my kitchen table. Then I washed my coffee cup, dried it, placed it in the cabinet, and called Laura. That was the morning I stopped trying to understand my brother's concern and started documenting his choices. Now Daniel believed the evening was unfolding exactly as he had planned. He did not know the trust had already been amended. He did not know the cameras had been checked. He did not know the glass had been preserved. Most of all, he did not know that silence was no longer something he could use against me. A soft knock came at the door. Natalie opened it just enough to look inside. "He is asking for the microphone," she said. Laura reached for the sealed container. I stood and smoothed the front of my dress. From the ballroom came the clear sound of Daniel tapping a spoon against his glass. The conversations faded. The room grew still. Then his warm, practiced voice carried through the door. "I would like to say a few words about my sister Evelyn." I looked at Laura. "Now," I said. We let him finish what he started. 21 days before the wedding, Daniel came to my house carrying a folder he said contained information I needed to see. Robert was repairing a loose step on the back porch, and Natalie had stopped by with fabric samples for the reception tables. Daniel waited until both of them left the kitchen before placing the folder beside my coffee. He called it a business opportunity. Inside was a proposal from Blue Ridge Horizon Development offering more than $2 million for 30 acres along the northern edge of Lake Carter. The land included a wooded slope, a narrow stretch of shoreline, and the old walking trail my father had cleared by hand when Natalie was a child. Daniel spoke quickly, emphasizing the price, the tax benefits, and the jobs the project might create. He said the company planned to build luxury vacation homes with private docks and a gated entrance. I read the first page, then closed the folder. "The land is not for sale," I said. His smile remained, but something behind it hardened. Daniel reminded me that the family trust existed to benefit both of us. I reminded him that the trust also required the trustee to preserve the property and consider its long-term value. Our father had placed me in that role because I had managed the taxes, maintenance, leases, and conservation agreements for nearly 15 years before he died. Daniel had lived in Atlanta during most of that time. He visited on holidays, walked the shoreline, and spoke about the lake as though remembering it were the same as caring for it. After our mother became ill, I moved closer to our parents and spent 6 years organizing medical appointments, household repairs, and financial records. Daniel sent flowers on birthdays and offered advice by telephone. When Father updated the trust, he named me trustee and Daniel as a possible successor. Daniel never challenged the decision while Father was alive. He only began questioning it after the funeral, when there was no longer anyone in the room whose authority he respected more than his own. He said Father had chosen me because I was nearby, not because I understood business. I did not answer. The folder in front of me proved that Daniel understood business well enough to know what the shoreline was worth. What he did not understand was why value could not always be measured by a sale price. The 30 acres protected the lake from runoff and kept the northern view free of construction. Deer crossed the trail every morning. Families who rented the small guest cabin used that path to reach the water. My father had rejected 2 earlier offers because he wanted the land preserved. Daniel called that sentimental thinking. I called it honoring the purpose of the trust. He leaned back in his chair and studied me. Then he asked whether Robert had influenced my decision. The question was delivered casually, but it was the first time he tried to place doubt between my judgment and my answer. Robert had never seen the proposal. He did not know Daniel was bringing it. I told my brother that my refusal belonged to me. Daniel tapped one finger against the folder and said marriage could make people protective of the wrong things. I asked what he meant. He smiled and said only that major decisions became complicated when new relationships entered old family arrangements. Before leaving, he asked me to keep the proposal for a week. I pushed the folder back across the table. My answer will be the same next week. He picked it up slowly. At the doorway, he turned and said the offer would not remain available forever. I told him some opportunities deserved to expire. That evening, Natalie returned with a final seating chart and found me looking through the trust documents at the dining room table. When I told her about Daniel's visit, she became quiet. She asked whether he had disclosed any prior contact with the developer. I said he had not. Natalie opened her laptop and searched the company name. Within minutes, she found a county planning record showing that Blue Ridge Horizon had requested preliminary access information 6 weeks earlier. The contact listed on the inquiry was Daniel Parker. I stared at his name on the screen. He had not brought me an opportunity. He had brought me a promise he had already begun making on property he did not control. I printed the record and placed it in a new folder. At the time, I believed I was documenting a disagreement over land. I did not yet understand that Daniel had already decided the real obstacle was not my answer. It was my authority to give it. The first change was so small that I almost dismissed it. 2 days after Daniel brought the development proposal, I arrived at my dentist appointment and learned it had been moved to the following week. The receptionist showed me a note in the system saying a family member had called on my behalf. When I asked who, she said the man had identified himself as my brother. Daniel later told Natalie that I had confused the date. By the time the story reached Aunt Carol, it had become another example of me forgetting appointments. I corrected him once. He smiled and said stress could affect anyone. The next incident happened in my own kitchen. I kept the trust records in a locked cabinet beside the pantry, organized by year and property. One morning, the folder containing the current tax statements was missing. I searched every shelf twice before calling the accountant to request copies. That afternoon, Daniel arrived carrying the folder beneath his arm. He said he had found it in the guest room during his last visit and assumed I had left it there. I had not taken those records upstairs. He placed the folder on the counter and looked at me with exaggerated patience. "You have a lot going on," he said. "The wedding, Robert, the property. Maybe it is becoming too much." I thanked him for returning it and wrote down the date after he left. A week later, he sent the family a message saying Sunday dinner had been moved from 6 o'clock to 4. He did not include me in the group. When I arrived at 6, everyone was finishing dessert. Daniel stood from the table and gave me a concerned look. "Evelyn, we discussed the time change yesterday." We had not. Natalie opened her telephone and checked the message thread. My name was missing. Daniel claimed it must have been an accident. Then he told our cousins that I had sounded distracted when he called. There had been no call. I watched the room absorb his version before anyone thought to question it. That was how he worked. He did not create one large lie. He created a series of small uncertainties, then allowed other people to connect them for him. If I objected, I seemed defensive. If I stayed quiet, his story settled into place. Natalie stopped treating the incidents as coincidences. She created a timeline on her laptop and saved screenshots of every message. She noted who had been present, what Daniel had said, and what the record showed. At first, I told her the effort felt excessive. She answered without looking up from the screen. "So, does what he is doing." Robert noticed the pattern in a different way. Daniel began calling him privately, asking whether I was sleeping well and whether I had become emotional about the wedding. He suggested that Robert should encourage me to step back from financial decisions until after the ceremony. Robert told him that my decisions were mine and that he would not discuss my health or finances without me. Daniel later told cousin Michael that Robert had become controlling. He turned a refusal to cooperate into evidence of isolation. The most unsettling moment came during a fitting for my wedding dress. I had left my reading glasses on the counter beside my purse. When I reached for them, they were gone. Daniel, who had stopped by unexpectedly, found them inside the refrigerator door. Everyone laughed at first. Then he said, softly enough to sound kind, "This is what I have been trying to tell you." I looked at the glasses in his hand and remembered that I had not gone near the refrigerator. Natalie had been standing beside me when I set them down. She met my eyes across the room. Neither of us said anything until Daniel left. Then she opened her laptop and added another line to the timeline.
"He moved them," she said.
I wanted to argue. I wanted to protect the brother I remembered from the man standing in front of me. Instead, I looked at the growing list on her screen. Missed appointment. Missing records. Changed dinner time. Private calls. Misplaced glasses. Every incident pointed in the same direction. Daniel was not waiting for me to become confused. He was arranging the room so everyone else would believe I already was. The email arrived 4 mornings before our final meeting with the wedding coordinator. Natalie called me at 7:15 and asked whether I was sitting down. Her voice had the same careful stillness she used when she was trying not to frighten me. I was in the kitchen spreading butter on toast while Robert read the weather report at the counter. I told her I was fine. She said Daniel had sent her a message by mistake. He had intended it for an attorney named Natalie Brennan, whose address appeared directly beneath my daughter's in his contacts. The subject line read, "Temporary trustee options before asset sale." Robert lowered the newspaper when he heard me repeat the words. Natalie forwarded the email while we remained on the telephone. I opened it on my laptop and read the first paragraph twice. Daniel described me as a 68-year-old trustee showing an increasing pattern of memory failure, emotional instability, and susceptibility to influence from a new spouse. He asked whether testimony from relatives could support a request for an independent capacity evaluation. Then he referred to my wedding as a useful opportunity to observe me in a public setting. The sentence was written in professional language, but its meaning was plain. He expected something to happen there, something that would make me appear confused in front of witnesses. Beneath the message were 3 attachments. The first was a draft timeline of the incidents he had created. My dentist appointment, the dinner time change, the missing tax folder, my reading glasses. Each event had been rewritten to remove his involvement and enlarge my supposed mistake. The second attachment was a letter from Blue Ridge Horizon Development confirming that Daniel had discussed the possible sale of 30 acres near Lake Carter. The company's representative thanked him for his assurance that a change in trust management was likely before the end of the year. The third attachment was a proposed consulting agreement that would pay Daniel a substantial fee if the sale closed. I stared at the screen until the toast beside me turned cold. Daniel had not been acting from wounded pride or a difference of opinion. He had assigned a price to my removal. Robert moved closer, but did not touch the laptop. "What do you want to do?" he asked. He did not tell me to confront Daniel. He did not offer to call him. He waited for my decision. That mattered more than he probably understood. Daniel had spent months claiming other people controlled me. Robert responded by giving me room to control what happened next. I called Natalie back and asked whether she had replied. She said no. I told her not to forward the message to anyone else and not to alert Daniel that he had made a mistake. Then I telephoned Laura Mitchell. She arrived at my house before 9 with a legal pad, a portable scanner, and 2 sealed document envelopes. Natalie joined us through a video call. Laura examined the original email headers, saved digital copies, and instructed Natalie to preserve the message exactly as it had arrived. She printed every attachment and asked me to describe each incident on Daniel's timeline. I answered slowly, giving dates, witnesses, and records. Laura did not interrupt. She wrote until 6 pages of her pad were filled. When I finished, she placed her pen down. "This is no longer a family disagreement," she said. "He is trying to manufacture a basis for removing you while negotiating a financial benefit for himself." Robert asked whether Daniel had broken any laws. Laura said that question would depend on what he had done, what he intended to do next, and what evidence could be preserved. She warned us not to speculate and not to accuse him publicly. If Daniel learned that we had the email, he could delete records, alter his story, or abandon one plan and create another. I looked through the kitchen window at the maple tree near the driveway. Its leaves had begun turning red around the edges. In 3 weeks, Robert and I would stand beneath an arbor and promise each other honesty. My brother planned to use that same day to prove I could not be trusted with my own decisions. Laura asked whether I wanted her to send Daniel a formal warning immediately. I thought of the concern in his voice, the glasses in his hand, and the gentle way he had told relatives I was changing. Every lie had depended on me reacting before I understood the whole design. I closed the laptop and folded my hands over the printed email. "I do not want him warned," I said. "I want him documented." Laura held my gaze, then nodded once. That was the moment the wedding stopped being the place where Daniel would expose my weakness. It became the place where he would reveal his own intentions. Laura moved quickly once I made the decision. The next morning, Robert and I met her at her office in Asheville, where she reviewed the trust agreement page by page. She explained that Daniel had been named only as a possible successor, not as an owner and not as someone entitled to control the property. That distinction mattered. His confidence had grown from an expectation, not a legal right. Laura prepared an amendment removing him from every future role connected to the trust. Natalie and a professional trust company would serve together if I could no longer manage it. I signed the documents in front of 2 witnesses 3 days later. Daniel was not notified. Laura said the amendment was valid the moment it was properly executed, but keeping it private would prevent him from changing his strategy before the wedding. We transferred the original deeds, tax records, insurance policies, and development correspondence from my home to secure storage. I changed every password connected to the trust, the lake house, and the property accounts. The accountant and property manager received written instructions that no information was to be released without my approval or Laura's office. Each step was quiet.
No argument.
No warning. Just one door closing after another. I continued speaking to Daniel as though nothing had changed. When he called to ask about the wedding schedule, I thanked him for being involved. When he offered to give a toast, I told him I would be honored. He sounded pleased. He had always mistaken access for influence, and I wanted him comfortable enough to believe he still had both. Natalie found that difficult. She wanted to confront him about the email and the consulting agreement. I reminded her that anger would give Daniel time to erase messages and reshape his story. "Let him keep believing we are behind him," I said. "He has been strongest when everyone questions themselves. He will be weakest when he stops questioning us." 6 days before the ceremony, Megan Foster, the vineyard manager, telephoned me. Daniel had contacted the venue twice. He said he wanted to help coordinate the reception and asked for a floor plan so older relatives could move easily between the dining room and the restrooms. The request sounded thoughtful until Megan noticed that he had marked the location of my table, the service bar, and the side hallway leading to the private office. He also asked whether the same server could keep my preferred drink filled throughout the evening. Megan knew Daniel was my brother, but she also knew I had assigned all reception decisions to her. She called because the details felt too specific. I asked her to speak with Laura before answering him. That afternoon, we met in the empty reception hall. Warm sunlight crossed the oak floor, and rows of unfinished table settings waited beneath the windows. Megan showed us the existing security cameras covering the entrance, dining area, and service bar. Laura asked that the system remain unchanged and that the recordings be preserved. Megan agreed to assign one experienced server to my table. Any drink left unattended would be removed and replaced without explanation. No one would accuse Daniel or create a scene. The goal was not to provoke him. It was to prevent harm and preserve facts. Natalie offered to stay beside me throughout the reception, but I refused. I wanted my daughter to celebrate, not spend the evening watching her uncle. She agreed to keep her telephone nearby and save any unusual messages. Robert listened to every plan and never once tried to take control. He asked only whether I still wanted the wedding to continue. I told him Daniel had already taken enough from the days leading up to it.
He would not take the
ceremony too. On the night before the rehearsal, Daniel stopped by my house with a bottle of sparkling cider and a card addressed to both of us. He hugged me in the kitchen and said he was relieved I had finally allowed the family to help. Then he glanced toward the folder of wedding papers on the counter and asked whether the trust amendment had been completed. I looked at him as though I did not understand the question. "Laura said we can review everything after the honeymoon," I answered. His shoulders relaxed. He smiled and said there was no hurry. After he left, I watched his car disappear beyond the maple trees. Daniel believed I had delayed the one decision that could stop him. In truth, that decision had already been signed, witnessed, and secured. The only thing left unfinished was the part he intended to reveal himself. The wedding morning arrived beneath a clear October sky, with a cool breeze moving through the vineyard and red leaves gathering along the stone path. I woke before sunrise in the small inn beside the property and sat near the window while the hills slowly appeared beyond the mist. For the first time in 3 weeks, I allowed myself to think only about Robert. He had waited patiently through every question, every meeting, and every change of plan. He never told me what decision to make. He simply reminded me that whatever happened next would still belong to me. Natalie arrived shortly after 8, carrying coffee, my pearl earrings, and the ivory gown we had chosen together. She asked whether I was frightened. I told her I was not afraid of marrying Robert. I was only disappointed that Daniel had chosen our wedding as the place to reveal who he had become. By noon, white roses framed the wooden arbor overlooking the vines. Nearly 80 guests filled the chairs, wrapped in light coats against the autumn air. Daniel arrived early in a charcoal suit and moved through the gathering with practiced warmth. He hugged relatives, complimented the flowers, and asked Megan whether the reception schedule had changed. When he reached me, he kissed my cheek and said I looked tired. The words sounded caring, but I heard the purpose beneath them. He wanted someone nearby to remember that he had noticed something wrong. I smiled and told him I had never felt more certain. His expression tightened for only a second. Then the music began. Robert waited beneath the arbor with a quiet smile that steadied the entire day. During our vows, I forgot the trust, the developer, and the folder of evidence in Laura's briefcase. Robert promised to stand beside me without ever speaking over me. I promised to build a life with him that honored everything we had survived before finding each other again. When the ceremony ended, the applause rose across the vineyard, and Daniel disappeared into the crowd before I could see his reaction. The reception hall glowed beneath strings of golden lights. Cream-colored linens covered the tables, and copper leaves circled the candles. Megan met me near the entrance and gave a small nod. The cameras were recording. My assigned server was ready. Laura sat near the back with several longtime family friends, appearing to be another guest. Daniel had no reason to believe anything had changed. During dinner, he watched every glass placed in front of me. He asked twice whether I had eaten enough, and once whether I needed something stronger to calm my nerves. I told him sparkling cider was all I wanted. He laughed and said I had become cautious. After dessert was served, the photographer called several relatives toward the windows for a group picture. I stepped away from my table and stood beside Aunt Carol. From that position, I could see the antique mirror behind the service bar. Daniel approached my empty chair carrying a folded napkin. He looked toward the dance floor. Then he looked toward the hallway. His hand moved briefly above my glass. The motion was small and controlled. He believed no one was watching. I did not turn around. Megan crossed the room with a tray before Daniel had taken more than a few steps. She removed the glass, placed a fresh drink at my setting, and carried the original through the side hallway. Later, she would seal it in a tamper-evident container, record the exact time, and document every person who handled it. For that moment, all Daniel saw was an ordinary server clearing a table. He returned to his seat and watched as I lifted the replacement glass. I took a small sip. His shoulders relaxed. Then he smiled. Robert approached and offered his hand for our first dance. We moved across the oak floor beneath the warm lights, while the band played a song we remembered from high school. Daniel stood near the edge of the room, checking his watch and waiting for confusion that never came. I followed Robert through every step without hesitation. When the music ended, our guests applauded. Megan passed behind me and whispered that the glass had been secured. I thanked her without turning my head. Across the room, Daniel reached for the microphone. He still believed the evening belonged to his plan. He did not yet understand that the mirror had seen everything. Daniel tapped the microphone twice and waited until the room became quiet. He began with a story from our childhood at Lake Carter, describing the summer I taught him to swim when he was 9 years old. He told everyone how I had stood waist-deep in the water with my hands extended, promising I would not let him sink. Several guests smiled. Aunt Carol wiped one eye with her napkin. For a few moments, Daniel sounded like the brother I had spent years trying to remember. Then his voice changed. He said I had always been the strong one in our family, but strength sometimes prevented people from admitting when they needed help. Robert covered my hand with his. Across the room, Natalie set down her glass and reached for her telephone. Daniel continued. He told our guests that I had recently missed appointments, misplaced important records, and arrived late to family gatherings. He mentioned my reading glasses without explaining how they had reached the refrigerator. He described every incident he had arranged as though he had merely witnessed it. Each example was small enough to sound believable. Together, they formed the false portrait he had been building for months. I watched several relatives exchange uncertain looks. Daniel saw them too. Confidence returned to his face. He said my marriage to Robert had happened during an emotionally vulnerable season, even though Robert and I had spent years rebuilding our friendship before we began dating. He suggested that major decisions involving family property should be delayed until everyone could be certain I was thinking clearly. He did not mention Blue Ridge Horizon development. He did not mention the consulting agreement or the fee he expected to receive. He spoke only about protection, responsibility, and the difficult choices families sometimes had to make. His words were polished because he had practiced them. His concern was convincing because he had rehearsed that too. Then he looked toward Natalie and said my daughter had noticed changes, but was understandably afraid to acknowledge them. Natalie stood. The legs of her chair moved softly across the oak floor. Daniel smiled, expecting support. Instead, she raised her telephone and said, "Please continue, Uncle Daniel. I want to make sure I record your exact words." The room became still. Daniel asked why she was recording a family toast. Natalie answered that he had publicly discussed my memory, my marriage, and my ability to manage legal responsibilities in front of nearly 80 witnesses. Accuracy mattered. His smile weakened. He said she was misunderstanding his intentions. Then he looked at me and claimed her reaction demonstrated how much tension my decisions had created within the family. I remained seated. "No one here appears tense except you," I said. A few guests turned toward Laura, who sat near the back of the room with her leather briefcase beside her chair. Daniel recognized her. He lowered the microphone slightly and asked whether I had invited my attorney to my wedding. I told him Laura had been my friend for 12 years and had every right to celebrate with us. That answer did not calm him. He began speaking faster. He insisted someone had to consider what would happen to the lake property if I could no longer handle the responsibility. Cousin Michael asked why Daniel was discussing the trust during a wedding toast. Aunt Carol asked whether he had been the person calling relatives about my supposed confusion. Daniel said the family needed to prepare before a crisis occurred. Natalie asked what kind of crisis he expected. He glanced toward my glass, then quickly looked away. The movement was brief, but I saw it. So did Laura. Daniel said that after what the family had witnessed recently, and after whatever happened that evening, there would be enough information to request a formal review of my position as trustee. The words settled over the room. He seemed to hear them only after they had left his mouth. He tried to correct himself, saying he meant the family could seek guidance if necessary. Natalie asked why he had already contacted an attorney about temporary trustee options. Daniel froze. His eyes moved from her telephone to me. "I do not know what you are talking about," he said. Natalie answered that the email had arrived in her inbox by mistake, along with his correspondence with the developer. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. This time, no one was wondering whether I had become confused. They were wondering how long Daniel had been lying. I lifted the safe glass Megan had placed before me and waited until my brother met my eyes. "Thank you, Daniel," I said. That was exactly the statement my attorney needed. Laura rose from her chair before Daniel could lower the microphone. She did not rush. She closed the distance between the back of the room and our table with the calm precision of someone who had spent years watching people reveal more than they intended. Megan appeared near the side hallway and quietly asked Daniel to join us in the private office behind the reception hall. He looked toward the ballroom doors, then toward the guests who were still watching him. Leaving immediately would have looked like an admission. Refusing would have raised another question. He placed the microphone on the table and followed us. Robert came with me. Natalie carried her telephone. Laura brought her briefcase. Megan entered last and closed the door. The music resumed softly outside, but the office remained still. On the wooden desk sat the sealed container, holding the glass Daniel had approached. Beside it were printed copies of the email, the development correspondence, the consulting agreement, and the amendment to the trust. Daniel saw the container first. His face changed for only a moment before he recovered. He said Megan had misunderstood an ordinary gesture. He claimed he had only straightened the napkin near my place. Megan answered that the security cameras had recorded the table from more than one angle. She had documented the time the glass was removed, who handled it, and where it had been secured. Laura added that no one in the room was making assumptions about its contents. The facts would be preserved and reviewed through the proper channels. Daniel turned to me and said I had staged the entire evening to embarrass him. I looked at the man who had spent months staging small moments to embarrass me. "You created the evening you are standing in," I said. "I only made certain it was recorded accurately." Laura opened the first folder. She placed the email in front of him and pointed to the sentence describing my wedding as an opportunity to observe a public incident. Daniel said the language had been taken out of context. Natalie placed the original message on the desk and explained that the full email, its attachments, and the delivery information had been preserved exactly as received. Laura then opened the second folder. Inside were the letters from Blue Ridge Horizon Development and the proposed consulting agreement. Daniel read the first page without speaking. The company had thanked him for predicting a change in trust management. The agreement promised him a fee if the sale of the 30 acres moved forward. He said the document was only a draft. Laura answered that a draft could still demonstrate motive, especially when it matched his private legal questions and public statements. He looked at Robert and accused him of turning me against my family. Robert did not argue. "Evelyn made every decision in this room," he said. Daniel turned back to me. He said Father had wanted the land to benefit both of us. I reminded him that Father had also chosen me to protect it. "You were not negotiating for the family," I said. "You were negotiating for yourself." Laura placed the final document on the desk. Daniel recognized the trust amendment before he finished reading the first page. His eyes moved quickly down the text, then stopped at the section removing him as successor trustee. Natalie and a professional trust company had been named in his place. His access to records and future property decisions had already ended. "When was this signed?" he asked. 3 days ago," Laura said. The confidence left his face. Until that moment, Daniel believed the wedding was a contest over whether he could take control from me. He now understood that the contest had ended before he arrived at the vineyard. The glass, the email, and the speech were not needed to save my position. They were evidence of what he had attempted after his position was already gone. Laura handed him a formal notice requiring all future communication about the trust to go through her office. The notice also instructed him to preserve every message, email, document, and recording connected to the developer and his efforts to remove me. Daniel asked what would happen next. Laura said the evidence would be reviewed and handled through the appropriate legal process. She offered no threat and no promise. The uncertainty belonged to him. He looked at me as though he expected anger, but anger was not what I felt. I felt the clean distance that comes when a truth has finally stopped asking to be denied. You are waiting for me to lose control, I said. You never noticed that I had already taken yours away. Daniel left through the side entrance, without returning to the ballroom. Megan walked him to the gravel drive while Laura remained in the office to secure the documents and confirm that every recording had been preserved. I stood beside Robert for a moment after the door closed. The room felt larger without my brother in it. Not emptier, clearer. Natalie asked whether I wanted to end the reception early. I looked through the narrow window at the tables glowing beneath the warm lights. Our guests were speaking quietly, uncertain whether celebration was still permitted. The cake remained uncut. The band waited beside the dance floor. I had already given Daniel months of my attention and nearly an hour of my wedding. I would not give him the rest of it. Robert offered me his arm, and we returned to the ballroom together. Conversation stopped when we entered. Aunt Carol stood first. She did not ask what had happened in the office. She only said the cake was waiting. That small kindness restored the room more effectively than an explanation could have. Robert and I cut the first slice while Natalie laughed because frosting touched the edge of my glove. The band began playing again. Chairs shifted closer. Guests returned to the dance floor one couple at a time. By the final song, the evening belonged to us again. The next morning, rain tapped against the windows of the inn. My wedding dress hung from the wardrobe door, carrying the faint scent of white roses. Robert poured coffee and asked whether I regretted allowing Daniel to attend. I considered the question carefully. I regretted what he had chosen to do. I did not regret seeing him clearly. Before noon, Laura sent formal notices by certified mail and email. Daniel could no longer contact the property manager, request trust records, or represent himself as acting for the family. Blue Ridge Horizon Development received notice that he had no authority to negotiate any sale involving the lake property. Megan transferred the sealed container and documentation through the proper professional channel. The vineyard preserved the security recordings. Natalie preserved the original email and the recording of Daniel's speech. Every step was handled quietly. There were no public accusations and no dramatic announcements. Daniel called 9 times during the first 2 days. I did not answer. He left messages saying the family should resolve the matter privately. I saved each message and forwarded it to Laura. It was an unusual request from a man who had tried to build his case in front of nearly 80 witnesses. Relatives began contacting me during the following week. Cousin Michael apologized for believing Daniel's questions had been harmless. Aunt Carol admitted that he had called her twice and suggested Robert was influencing me. Others said they had noticed inconsistencies, but had been afraid to create conflict. I accepted their apologies without pretending trust returned simply, because regret had arrived. Some relationships would heal through consistent choices. Others would remain more distant. Daniel sent one handwritten letter. He reminded me of summers at Lake Carter, our father's old fishing boat, and the afternoon I taught him to swim. He said shared history should matter more than one mistake. I read the letter twice, then placed it inside Natalie's timeline folder. Shared history explained why his betrayal hurt. It did not erase the planning behind it. 3 months later, Robert and I met Laura at the lake house. Winter sunlight rested across the silver water, and the wooded slope Daniel had tried to sell stood untouched. We signed a long-term conservation agreement protecting the 30 acres from development. Then we walked through the house with an architect and discussed converting part of it into a retreat for older women rebuilding their lives after loss, estrangement, or sudden change. The first floor would include 3 private bedrooms, a shared kitchen, and a sunroom facing the lake. We planned to welcome the first small group the following autumn, after the permits, insurance, and renovations were complete. Standing on the porch, I understood what I had truly protected. It was not only land. It was the right to decide what my life, my marriage, and my parents' legacy would become. Daniel believed he was fighting me for a piece of property. He never understood that every lie had cost him something more valuable than acreage. He had traded away the right to be trusted. I did not take that from him. I only stopped pretending he still possessed it.